Okay, welcome to our section, Utility, Marginal Utility, and Indifference Curve Analysis. So this section we look at consumers and the choices they make, and we start with the simple question of why is there demand for a product? Soon we'll be talking about the demand curve, demand and supply. So why is there demand for a product? And the answer is relatively obvious, just that consumers want it. Right? Why do you demand particular products? Because you like the products. You gain enjoyment from the particular product or utility. If you go to any store, there's thousands of possible choices on where to spend your money. So in general, consumers, though, are going to spend the money on products that will give you the highest amount of satisfaction. If you have a set amount of money, how do you spend it to make yourself as happy as possible? Well, spend it on the products that give you the most, so we'd say bang for the buck. So the concept within economics and the term that we use for this often is utility. Utility, it's satisfaction that the consumer receives. So economists use this theory of choice where we study the utility a consumer receives from the purchases that he or she makes. This theory is based on the fact that consumers are going to spend the income in a way that gives them the most possible happiness, right? A certain amount of money, you will spend that money to make yourself as happy as you can make yourself, or to maximize your utility. So we will be looking at, in this lesson, the idea of how do you maximize your utility, or how do you make the correct choices, basically on the front of you're going to spend your money to make yourself as happy as possible. If it weren't for money, you could attempt to measure utility by looking at what you trade one product for another product. That would be just stunningly difficult to do, though. How many, the little example question on these slides, how many hammers would you give up to go see a movie, right? Or if you wanted to go to the store to buy a donut in the morning, what do you give them if there's not money? This goes back to the idea of how tough life would be with bartering. But if we had to measure utility that way, it would be very difficult, because largely we wouldn't necessarily know the base unit to judge things by. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that, right? We have money. If you go to the store, you know how much a donut costs because it's expressed in terms of dollars and cents. Same with every other product. So because of this, you can think about the satisfaction you gain as well in terms of money, because if you don't buy one particular product, you could buy a different particular product or service. Money can be used in a whole host of different ways. You don't have to worry about trading one product for another. Just have to look at how much money a consumer gives up or is willing to give up to measure the satisfaction he or she receives from a particular product. So two differential concepts within utility that we have to kind of get these definitions out of the way first before we start to go into some problems and look at things. Total utility versus marginal utility. Total utility, I think, is relatively straightforward. So it's you buy so many units of a particular product. Total utility measures the total satisfaction you're getting from that product. And the way it does that, it's the total amount of money you'd be willing to exchange for it. If you go to the store and buy 4 items of clothing, how much money are you paying for all 4 items of clothing? Right? Or that might not quite be the right way to phrase that. How much money would you have been willing to pay? Usually you can get things for less than what you would have been willing to pay, but what would have been the most you'd pay to get all 4 of those items of clothing? That's your total utility. The maximum amount of money you would pay to get some quantity of a product. If you're going to, if you're buying season tickets to sporting events or theater or whatever, what's the total amount of money you'd be willing to pay to obtain those season tickets? That is your total utility. The total satisfaction is represented by the total amount of money you would give up to get the particular product, to get all of those units of the product. Total utility, in a way, I think is more straightforward. Marginal utility, and we will be using marginal analysis often in this class. When you see the word marginal, in your mind, you should start to think additional. So marginal utility is the maximum amount of money you'd pay to get one more unit of the product. So let's say you have picked out 3 items of clothing already. How much more would you spend for the 4th item of clothing? Right? That's a different concept than the total utility, which is the total amount you'd be willing to give up for all 4 units. If you've already picked out 3 units and you're going to buy that, how much more would you spend for the 4th unit? Right? Very different questions. Marginal utility, and marginal utility specifically, marginal analysis in general. Often it takes a while to kind of let this idea of how to think marginally sink in. The book has good examples of this. Highly recommend spending some time thinking about what it means when we do marginal analysis. So marginal utility, how much are you willing to spend for one more unit? Later in the semester, we're going to be talking about marginal costs and marginal revenue, marginal profits. The concepts of marginal analysis will keep coming up, and we will be using them in trying to figure out what's the best decision that could be made. So it is important, the sooner you can kind of get this soaked in and realize how to go about this marginal analysis, the better off you'll be for the class. Okay. So we're going to go through an example. So we have a consumer. Suppose we have a consumer here. 4 units of a product. You could think of any particular product here. So with the prices listed here, what would be a couple of products that might be realistic? Maybe it's slices of pizza at a store. Maybe it's candy bars. Although if it's candy bars, you kind of assume, yeah, it could be candy bars. Yeah. So maybe it's slices of pizza, maybe it's candy bars. So how much is the consumer willing to pay for the first unit in this example? $2. How much is the consumer willing to pay for the second unit, assuming they've already had the first unit? That's $1.25. The third unit, if they've already had 2, the consumer is willing to pay 50 cents for. And the 4th unit, if they've already had 3, the consumer, it's in parentheses, it's negative 25 cents. That's the red in parentheses indicates that it's negative. So if you think about slices of pizza, though, this might make sense, right? If you're at a buffet, that first piece of pizza, you might think, wow, I would have paid $2 for this. This is good. Second one, you might eat it and think it's still pretty tasty, but not quite as good as the first, right? Then you'd say that's worth $1.25. The third one, 50 cents. 4th one, if you're at a buffet, you may stop at 3, right? Because the 4th one, even if you don't have to pay any money for it, it's just not worth it to you, right? Because you'll be full, or you're worried about calories, or whatever the concern is. The 4th one has a negative value. So you could imagine this type of scenario happening often, and often you'll see this type of trend, right? If you're buying songs on iTunes, you want to get a few new songs, right? The first new song you get might be worth a lot more than the second new song you get. So the first new song means at least you have one new thing to listen to. The second one, though, still valuable. The third one, I would, with songs on an iPod, I would not expect negative values. Right, at the worst, you'd expect 0 because you can always delete it, so that might not be quite as applicable for the 4th unit. But you'd expect this type of trend where the willingness to pay drops for most particular products. So you could imagine this with candy bars or pizza or a lot of different things. Let's see, how do we translate this into total utility and marginal utility? Well, for marginal utility, it's pretty easy. Let's actually go back to our definition of marginal utility. It's the maximum amount of money consumers willing to pay for one more unit of a good. When we go to the chart, what we're showing is the maximum willingness to pay for one more unit of a good. So we can just change the willingness to pay to marginal utility. Right? You could in your notes, just put a little slash there and put it in parentheses that this is marginal utility as well. That's the willingness to pay for one more unit. So the first unit, the satisfaction the consumer gains is $2. Second, it's $1.25. Third, it's 50 cents. And fourth, it's negative. So how does this relate to total utility? Well, once again, let's go back to the definition of total utility. It's the total amount of money a consumer is willing to pay for all of the units of a product, the total utility of a quantity of the good. Okay, so the total utility for one unit, what's the total amount the consumer is willing to pay? Well, it's the willingness to pay for one unit, it's just $2. For the second unit, the willingness to pay is $1.25, right? That's the marginal utility. So the willingness to pay is $1.25 for the second unit. So what's the total utility? Well, the consumer gets $2 in satisfaction from unit 1 and $1.25 in satisfaction from unit 2. Total utility is $3.25. For the third unit, the total utility, well, you get $2 in satisfaction from the first, $1.25 and 50 cents. And we could fill in the chart. It's just adding up the marginal utilities. Note, the fourth unit's negative. Now, the only way that you're going to get the negative, really, is if you're forced to consume this last unit. Right, as long as you're not forced to consume the last unit, it won't ever be negative. It could drop down to close to zero. But certainly there are products where that you wouldn't even want to take it. Right, disposal would be problematic. One product that, even though you can dispose of it sometimes for free, most people don't take for free are televisions that are, say, maybe 10 years old anymore, that aren't high definition televisions. Right? They're big and bulky, and the picture isn't nearly as good as the high def televisions, which now aren't that expensive to purchase. A lot of people would have a negative willingness to pay for it. You can't really it's tough to give away old televisions. So there are products where the marginal utility is negative. I would not take an old television for free right now, like a 10-year-old television. It would just be a hassle. I think a lot of you think of various products where that would happen. Now, of course, usually you won't consume that, and there's a really good reason why you won't consume that. Is why would you consume something that makes you worse off? So marginal utility is the extra amount you'd be willing to pay for one more unit. Total utility is the sum of all of the marginal utilities, or it's the total satisfaction you get by consuming some quantity of the good. So it's always the same for the first unit. The second unit, you get some extra amount of satisfaction. The total utility captures the satisfaction from the first unit and the satisfaction from the second unit. For the third unit, you get the $2, the $1.25, and the 50 cents. Relatively straightforward.